In case you couldn't tell, that was medieval music, brought to you by Master David and Miss Tristana. Thanks very much for that. I'm here to just talk about one of my long-term hobbies, medieval arms and armor, and a lot of things medieval. I mean, the culture is very much involved with that, and the history of the place, and the economics, and so on, so I will digress. My interest started when my family moved to Europe, and I was a little kid, and I saw my first castle, and all of a sudden, King Arthur was true. You know, Robin Hood really existed. All that stuff that I'd heard about was given flesh and bones, kind of, and so I forced my mom and dad to take me to every castle that we could find in Europe, and there are thousands, so it was lots of fun. I had to put up with cathedrals, which was what my mom liked, so we did a cathedral, then we do a castle, back and forth. Anyway, I'm currently, well, not with COVID, but before COVID and hopefully at some point after, I can be active with a living history group called the Company of the Wolf Argent, which is modeled on a 15th century, that's 1400s, Burgundian military unit. So we'll talk a little bit about the growth of armor and weapons during the Middle Ages, and the period I represent, the late 1400s, is kind of the apex of all that, and it went downhill after that. Gunpowder had already been around for about 150 years in Europe on battlefields, but it took them that long to figure out how to use it effectively. So there were gunners, they got better and better at using that, and that made armor less and less effective. Also, armor just became so expensive. Craftsmen were turning out hundreds of thousands of suits of armor, and it bankrupted lots of kingdoms and dukedoms and all the different people who had to buy the armor for their troops. So it just became less and less worthwhile. Although armor has stuck around, the French actually in World War I, it had to be early in the war, they still had a troop of cavalry called the cuirassiers, which means the breastplated ones, who had breastplates and helmets of metal with big horsehair crests. And in 1914, probably, they charged the attacking Germans, who were a lot more modern and had machine guns. So you can guess what happened there. The French stopped using their cavalry charges with the cuirassiers, and it wound up becoming more of a modern war. However, our GIs, our soldiers, and soldiers all over still wear armor. Let me start, first of all, by explaining the Middle Ages. Okay, Middle Ages means in between the ancient world, okay, so think of Greece and Rome, and the modern world. Think of the discovery of America. So that's a huge span. That's something like 1,000 years, about. So there's no one thing that I can tell you about the Middle Ages. They covered, you know, the early part is often called the Dark Ages, the latter part is called the Renaissance, but the Middle Ages include both of those. So, and everything in between. My period ends right around when Columbus got to the New World. That gives you some perspective. I'm 20 years ahead of him. And what I studied in Burgundy is true for much of Europe, including Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was a little more influenced by the Asian steppes, but there are lots of similarities. So pretty much all of Europe had a very similar culture. So, without further ado, some of the earliest stuff is still represented. What I have here, for example, what I'm wearing, let me say that. Anybody tell me what it is I'm wearing here, this lovely tailored garment? What do you think it is? Pardon? I don't have my hearing aids. Somebody yell for me.
Chain, he said.
Yes, it's chain links, chainmail. It's called mail. This was one of the earliest forms of metal armor. Iron armor. Okay, they had bronze before, but they started in Central Europe. Okay, people started making stuff like this 500 BC. Some of the earliest mail that we found is from 500 BC. So chainmail was around for almost the entire Middle Ages and part of the ancient period. So it's very, very, it's simple in concept, and it takes hundreds of hours to make it. What you have to do is start off with wire, coil it in a ring, flatten the two ends so that they fit together, punch a hole, and put a rivet through it, and hammer the rivet flat. You've got one ring, okay? Then you have to do it again with another ring. Then you have to do it again with another ring. Thank you. And that becomes, obviously it'll take hundreds of hours to make a shirt like this by hand. Now we can do it for reenactors by machine. Or you pay somebody a lot of money to do it by hand. Right, and one of the earliest weapons is right here. One of the earliest weapons is a pointy stick.
You can take your mask off that far from
Oh, well, that's true. That's true. So they, oh, this is very high tech. Holy cow! All right. One of the earliest weapons that people ever came up with, as far as we know, probably from caveman days, was a pointy stick. Right? And that's basically what this is. This is a spear, and it was in use in different, slightly different forms, but basically the spear was in use from prehistory up until the present day. Can anybody tell me who still uses a long pointy stick? Yeah?
Native Americans.
Native Americans don't do that anymore unless they're in the army. Do you know what we have in the army that's similar to a long pointy stick? It's very expensive long pointy stick.
Bayonet.
It's called a rifle with a bayonet on the end of it. Okay? Exactly. The bayonet is basically a long pointy stick so that you can reach the other person with it. But the idea of the spear has been around a long time, and you'll notice that this pulls right off. That's so that if you throw the spear and it misses, your enemy will pick it up and they'll have to stick it back together before they can throw it at you. The head might get stuck in the ground and then they just have a big stick. So that was one of the things the Vikings did, especially, was they would throw their spears with the head just sitting there. Let me put that down. I hope nobody bumps into that. So that's some of the earliest stuff. Once we get to my period, the 1400s, you've had chainmail around, or mail shirts. You've had them for literally about 1,000 years. But the latest development was plate armor, being able to take sheets of steel and shape it to form breastplates and helmets. The advantage to that is it can be lighter but better protection at the same time. It's just a lot more expensive to make. Now, hang on. Let me get this out.
Yes. You need an assistant.
That here is a copy of a helmet from the 1400s. Right? The visor won't stay open without this clip. Okay, there we go. So you can see it gives really good protection. It covers the back of my neck, my entire head. It weighs about 8 pounds. So it's not an easy thing to carry around on your head all day, but protecting the brain is one of the first things you want to make sure you do. So helmets were one of the only pieces of armor that lots of people had, but you'd make sure you had this, and there's a liner inside, because you have to have padding. You can't just have a sheet of steel pressed against your head. It doesn't do you any good. Somebody hits you there, and it's basically like they're hitting directly into your head. You have to have some kind of padding or suspension. So, the helmet, oh, wait a second. It's too big. That's because there's another layer that goes underneath the helmet. That's in here. All right. There's this cap, it's padded, it goes underneath. Then there's the hood of mail that goes on. And there's actually a right side out and a wrong side out to this. The rivet heads stick out on one side. You don't want that against your clothing because it snags and catches. So what we've got is more mail. And there we are, okay? Now, my neck, throat, sides of my head are protected. The helmet goes on, fits a lot more snugly, okay? So you can see that some of the targets, even with the helmet on, there are still some areas that are vulnerable. You will always have that. Armor cannot protect you completely, right? It's really good to cover most of the targets that people are going for, but there are still gaps, okay? Gaps here, okay? Gaps here, my hands, my forearms, okay? Even with the visor down, here we go. Let's do that. Even with the visor down, up here, okay, in through here, those are all targets, and people who knew what they were doing would go after those. So armor had to be well, I can't really say comfortable. It had to be wearable, not too heavy, but it had to be also, you know, it had to cover as much as it could. So you covered the most vital areas. Okay, now as a foot soldier, I don't have to worry about my legs. They're far away from everybody's attack. If I have a sword, the nearest target is going to be at shoulder length. Okay, that's the side of the triangle. If I go for something lower like a leg, I'm shortening the distance I can be effective at. Okay, and the other guy can drive me back by attacking my head, which is much more vulnerable anyway. So they didn't worry too much about armor. If you were on foot, they didn't worry too much about armor on the legs. Okay, if you rode a horse, that put your legs and feet up where everybody could get at them with their nasty, choppy things. So if you rode a horse, in other words, if you were really wealthy or if you were being supported and somebody was buying you armor because it was very expensive, you'd have to wear a full suit of armor in my period. But the foot soldiers, also, they did a lot of walking around, so they didn't want to have maybe another 20 pounds of steel on their legs. If I have my helmet on and my breastplate, I've got 45 pounds of steel extra on my body, and that doesn't count my sword, my sword, my battle axe, things like that. One of the things that I should point out. Well, you know what? I can do this. Janine, could you help me buckle, please? One of the things that I should point out is that you wanted to wear as much armor as you could afford and still move around in. It was a balancing act. Okay, yeah, other side. No, in back, please. Get that up and over. Loosen it loosen it if you can. Yeah, that's too tight. I tightened it for storage. Okay, here we go. Now, if I were wealthy, I would have servants to do this for me. Okay?
Instead of white.
Well, and families would follow you around if you were a soldier. There were lots of reasons for that. One was there were lots and lots of jobs that an army needed doing. If the Duke of Burgundy calls up the army and says, we're marching on Switzerland, we're going to take those Swiss and make them our subjects, which is something he did. Didn't work out well for him, but that was his plan. He would have his army of whatever, 5,000 or 8,000, and they would bring their families. The families would do laundry. They would do mending and tailoring. They would help you into your armor. They would cook food. They would bake bread. They would all the jobs necessary to supply the army would be taken care of by the camp followers. All it meant was people who followed the army camp. There was no derogatory meaning to the word camp follower back when it was coined. I think there's some it's become, see, that's the problem with armor. Okay. It's a little awkward. All right. Now, to keep my breastplate on, this is a very simple breastplate. To keep it on, I need a belt around my middle. There were no pockets in the clothing, so you carried a pocket or a wallet. That's this thing. You might carry, well, one of the nice things about being a soldier and why it was an attractive profession is they had to pay you in money. You actually got coin. Most people living in villages who weren't at war, they got paid in chickens or eggs, or somebody said, okay, I owe you, I'll help you plow your field. It was a barter system still. But the armies got actual coins, and that was portable. It was a lot of times coins were highly valued. People would prefer coin because it's easy to get, and so it made being a soldier an attractive financial deal. So you can see, I've got pretty much all I need now to move around in. I've got my armor on. I've got mail under it to protect some of the more vulnerable areas. And this suit, it's a little sticky, but there's a rivet here. It's supposed to slide up and down so that I can bend over and the armor will bend a little bit with me. But this technology, all right, the technology of being able to make armor like this didn't develop until the 1300s, the late 1300s, and they kept getting better and better at it. Some of the last suits of full suits of armor that you'll find were absolutely beautifully crafted and very flexible, and where you'll see them at the Met. The Met has one harness, one suit that is, it looks like it was made, I think, in the mid-1500s, and it looks like a suit of civilian clothing from that period, all in steel. That's when they had the puffs on the sleeves with the slashes in them, and the sleeves of the armor have puffs of steel with little decorative slashes in them. The thing's gorgeous. It was probably made for a count or a duke or a king or a prince, because they're the only people who could afford it. A full suit of armor was the equivalent of today being able to buy maybe a fully loaded Ferrari, something like that. Just incredibly expensive and out of reach of most people. There were other people who made armor, and they made cheaper armor, and that's what the wealthy guys would buy for their soldiers. It didn't work as well, but it was armor. It was mass-produced armor. So there, by the end of the Middle Ages, by the 1400s and 1500s, there were whole cities churning out certain things. The guilds were very powerful, and the guilds controlled who made what. So by my period, by the period of Columbus getting ready to come over and say, oh look, a new place to conquer, that was Europe. It was pre-industrial, but they were developing cottage industries into citywide industries. So let me see. Another thing that led to the fall of armor. People will always say it's gunpowder, and sure, gunpowder had a big role to play in that. But another thing that happened with armor was it stopped being as effective. Used to be that an armored knight, fully armored with his horse, with some armor on the horse as well, was like a tank on the battlefield. Almost indestructible, and just could gallop around. They rode stallions, by the way. So if any of you have ridden, most people don't ride stallions anymore. They have they can be aggressive, they can be hard to control, but when you're in battle on a horse, you want somebody who's kind of aggressive. So some of the horses, if you ever have seen the Lipizzaner horses, they're trained to do some of the maneuvers that developed on the battlefields of Europe. Two that I like, I don't know what they're called, but two that I like of the horse's maneuvers. One is the horse jumps up and kicks out in all directions and then lands on his feet again. And that's really handy if you're surrounded by foot soldiers and you just want to clear a little space, and the horse just lifts off and knocks over at least 4 people at the same time. Another one of the moves is the horse sits back on his hind legs and rears up and holds it. That gives the commander another couple of feet up in the air to look around and see what's going on, and then he can drop back down. So the very expensive suit of armor and the very wealthy commanders also paid lots and lots for their well-trained horses, and believe me, they trained. The horses were trained, the riders were trained. Their purpose was to be the military. So you had a whole class of people who were supposed to be the military and the police and the administrators all rolled into one. And that was the aristocracy. And they were very effective for hundreds and hundreds of years at doing that. It started to fall apart with the rise of the middle class. Other people who didn't have that obligation or training became wealthier even, and were able to influence politics, which kind of is what it all came down to. The training that they did was done, first of all, with these, okay? Children, believe it or not, would be given these things and taught how to use them, as they're slightly lighter than actual swords. But the children, you know, to learn what you're doing, you have to start practicing. Now, you can picture, you're giving your children baseball bats and saying, okay, why don't you go hit bats with Charlie? Okay? So they had a higher tolerance for injury in the Middle Ages, as far as we can tell. They you know, it's, oh yeah, you got a broken finger. I used to get broken fingers all the time. You know, rub some dirt on it, you'll be fine. So the culture was different. But one of the things that is nice, and I have found this out only as an adult, one of the things that's nice is the sword fights you see in almost any movie are very unrealistic. I grew up with Errol Flynn fighting, what was his name, Guy of Gisborne, and in Robin Hood. And they're basically doing fencing, modern Olympic fencing, with short swords, which just doesn't fit. Some of the manuals that were written back in the Middle Ages to teach sword fighting or to entice people to take classes with the masters have shown that sword fighting was a very subtle and quick art. It wasn't fencing, it was more of a combination of wrestling and wrestling with swords. So you can imagine they have to tolerate some injury. But it's fascinating. Some of the moves are once you see them, they're obvious, and you go, oh, why don't they put that in movies? It's because it's over too fast. In the movies, they want to draw out the drama, they want to make it a scene, so they can't have it over in 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds. They have to draw it out. But if somebody knows what they're doing, the fight is decided within 2 or 3 moves. Even if both people know what they're doing. And if one of them doesn't score a hit, they back off. Because it's like, well, I got to figure this guy out. He knows what he's doing. But so the study of medieval fighting has enjoyed a renaissance, pardon me, but it's enjoyed a rebirth in modern days. There's apparently it's very attractive to young women too. You'll see lots and lots of groups of women sword fighters nowadays studying how to do this, and men too, but that's kind of a given. But you'll also see that it's very popular with lots of women to study sword fighting. So I'm going to, I have a few really nice swords, and I have my usual sword that I carry around during reenactments. As you can tell, this is my regular old sword. It's rather battered and dinged and rusted. It's a kind of sword that's unusual to most of us for the Middle Ages. Most of us think of the sword that have a straight blade with 2 edges. But this kind of sword, it's called a falchion, was a very, very common sword for foot soldiers. Because foot soldiers would find themselves in massed battles with lots and lots of different people. And you want something relatively short that's good at chopping and poking. And so the falchion was something that had been around in different forms for hundreds of years. It's just, we think, the reason there aren't many of them, and I think you can count how many have survived on your fingers and toes, and that's all, that have survived from hundreds of years in Europe, is because you can cut it down and make a kitchen knife out of it. You can use the steel to make, and this is a common thing. A butcher would say, oh yeah, I've got an old falchion. I use it for, cutting the oxen up into pieces and selling them at my shop. It was seen as a utilitarian tool, so it didn't have the cachet of the longsword. So if we look at illustrations of the time, and one of the nice things about medieval illustrators is they tried to be very accurate with the stuff that they knew. So medieval arms and armor in illustrations, if they're drawing pictures of Europeans, they're very accurate. If they're drawing pictures of exotic people, like Arabs during the Crusades, or Russians, way out east there, then they get fanciful and they make stuff up. But stuff that they knew, they were generally very, very reliable as in their accuracy. Now, the two swords that are much nicer quality that I have, one's a longsword and one is just a sword. It's also referred to as a one-handed sword or an arming sword, but back in the day, it was just a sword. It was a one-handed sword. This is the one-handed sword. There were lots of different styles, but none of it was standardized. This one is a very, very sharp one, okay? And it's also, if you can see it, it has a little ridge down the middle of the blade. That makes it a stiffer blade, okay? And you would want a stiffer blade if you were thrusting, okay? Now, you wouldn't thrust at this, because a sword will do nothing against plate armor, except make noise, okay? But a sword is really good against mail. You don't even need to go for where I'm not covered in mail. You can actually go for where I have mail, and this point will get through it. And it's possible that the point will actually pop open the rivet. Because remember, the rivets are tiny little things. So with enough force, you can actually put pressure on this and the point will pop open the rivet and get through the armor. So yes, swords can be effective against chainmail, okay? But not in the slash, okay? You'll see in movies, again, you'll see somebody slashing at chainmail and the guy doubles over and falls down. That just wouldn't happen. The mail is good protection against the slash. So now I hope I've ruined movies for somebody who's going to sit there like I do and go, why did they do that? Why didn't they have them do that? I'm a critic. So that sword I just showed you was a design that became popular right around the time that plate was taking over. So in the late 1300s, swordsmiths tried to find a way they said, okay, well, we can't do anything about the plate. Let's make something that's really good with mail, because they still have to wear that. And so that design came out in the late 1300s and lasted until the mid 1400s, when there was just more and more plate. Now, okay, this is called a long sword, okay, because it's about 4 feet long, okay. It's designed to be used, it's light enough, this only weighs about 3 pounds. So it's light enough to be used on horseback, where you need the extra reach, with one hand, okay? There's room for 2 hands. It's not a 2-handed sword, though. Those are bigger and heavier. This is a 1.5-handed sword, or a long sword, or a bastard sword, it was also called, because it was kind of in between the one-handed and the 2-handed. But this was designed to use as a slashing weapon from horseback, because when you're riding around, it's kind of hard to thrust. You're moving, the horse is moving, the other people are moving, so you're just kind of cutting at and trying to avoid hitting your horse. But there was a new style of fighting that grew in Europe during the 1400s, when these swords started to become popular. Civilians would wear these, okay, and remember I said society was changing, so it wasn't just the knights who would swagger around town wearing swords, if they were allowed. Lots of towns tried to make ordinances where, no, you can't carry a sword, things like that. But there were a lot of examples of people carrying long swords, and then they had to learn how to fight with them. And more importantly, if you've got somebody who's got a long sword who's a bully, you want to know how to defend yourself, because there were no police. Okay, you were your own policeman, basically. Okay, you and your friends were your own policemen. You and your retainers and servants had to enforce the law. So it wasn't, well, In some cities, life was very rough and ready. In other cities, it was better regulated. They did have a night watch or a town watch in some cities, especially in Germany. Well organized, and they knew about rules and how to obey them. But these became popular as the middle class became wealthier and more powerful. And so lots of people who weren't aristocrats and who weren't wealthy, well, they were wealthy enough, but the middle class and the upper middle class started arming themselves as if they were knights and as if they were nobles. And so that drove an entire industry of learning how to fight with the longsword. And this has become a popular weapon, as I said, that there's been a resurgence in the study of fighting with swords, especially fighting with long swords in America and Europe, mostly in Australia and New Zealand too. Okay, I've gabbled quite a bit and covered a lot. What kind of questions do you have? I'd appreciate any kind of questions, or challenges. You can say, wait, I heard that something else, and I could be wrong. Or I could be right. Anybody have a question? I'll have to ask. I don't wear my hearing aids when I have all this stuff on, because they just don't work. They just go, so
I'll repeat questions.
you can shout at me, hon. Okay, behind you.
How would somebody carry a sword that long?
All right. Horizontally. Okay? It's carried, okay. This short one could still be carried pretty much vertically, okay? And you could walk around with it, right? But the longer one was slung at more of an angle. Now, which always brings to mind, there's a Woody Allen movie, I forget, it was a takeoff on War and Peace. And his character was bowing to people and goosing them with the end of his sword because the thing sticks out and it's very awkward. I always, see what I mean? I'm just a natural, that wasn't on purpose. But yeah, it has to be suspended. The sheath has to be suspended more or less horizontally. And again, it was originally supposed to be for horseback use. The extra length, because you have to be able to reach farther on a horse, and the ability to use it one-handed because you need one hand for the reins, usually. But it became popular as one of the things you have to understand about that whole period from like the end of the Roman Empire until well into the Age of Discovery is how you looked, how you presented yourself was kind of the only way to enforce your reputation. The clothes you wore, how much fabric you had covering you, because fabric was expensive, so the more folds you had and the longer the trail of your gown, the wealthier and more important and powerful you were. Those were vitally important. People bankrupted themselves to try to look wealthy, to show off their possessions. Okay, so if there's a sword that makes you look like you're upper class, you'll use it, you'll wear it. Okay, even if it's awkward. Doesn't matter if it's awkward. Yes.
Are people going to be allowed to touch any of this stuff?
I think so. Yeah.
Like the kids.
Bedhead. Sure. They can. Now, I do have to say, I don't want, okay. This and the spear are just a little too awkward. I don't want people touching that because it's top heavy. It's made to swing down and smack something hard. So I don't want that to happen. But you can come up and you can even, with supervision, hold the swords by the handles. The blades are sharp, so don't touch the blades. The helmet, certainly. The chainmail you can touch.
And you can use this and then a paper towel,
Yeah, and
but you can't wash this stuff.
Yeah, and I also have brought some books with some pictures of different kinds of armor and different kinds of weapons and people from. I think those books only cover about the year 1000 up to about 1500. So it covers part of the Middle Ages. But let me, before that,
I
let
have
me
another
say,
question
yeah.
before anybody has to leave. What's the biggest myth about armor that you think is out there?
Oh boy. Probably the biggest myth. Pardon me, I always forget this. The question was, what's the biggest myth about armor? One of the ones that surprises me is that a lot of people think armor was so heavy that you needed help. If you were knocked to the ground, you needed help standing up, or that you couldn't get on your horse without somebody lifting you up there. And that would mean you would die. If that were true, armor just wouldn't have worked. One of the things that I'm noticing is how heavy this is. I said I have about 45 pounds of armor. That's not unlike what we expect soldiers to carry nowadays. Not necessarily in armor, but in ammunition and weapons and their kit, their first aid, communications, all that stuff that they have to carry. So 40 pounds is not an unreasonable amount of weight, or 50 pounds, or 55 pounds. If you train in it, you can jump onto your horse's back on your own, which you would have to do. You'd have to be able to do that. No servant is going to come running out to help you on your horse when there are 100 people around swinging battle axes and maces and swords. So I think the myth of the ridiculously heavy armor was given to us by jousting armor, which in some cases, again, the Germans had a special kind of joust. After the age of armor was gone, they did this in the 1600s. It was called Rennstechen, which means running sticking. And basically you got in this huge suit of armor with a helmet that was bolted onto the shoulders of the breastplate, so you were pretty much immobile. So it wasn't armor for fighting, it was armor for sitting on the back of your horse and charging into somebody who was also dressed like that and breaking a lance on their body. But you were completely encased in heavy, heavy steel, it was a show. It was basically show armor. So yes, that armor did exist, but nobody who was actually going into a fight would wear it. And it didn't even exist back in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. Yeah.
What was the casualty rate in your period that compared to battles we're more familiar with, like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and so on?
Well,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah. What was the casualty rate during the late Middle Ages as opposed to more modern times, like the Civil War, the Second World War, that kind of thing? It's sad, but maybe good. We're getting much better at medicine. Medicine back in the Middle Ages was not understood. A lot of physicians were formulating theories and testing them out, but they didn't know how the body worked, or they didn't know what infection was. They knew it existed, but they didn't know what caused it. So a wound in the Middle Ages could easily lose you a limb or kill you. It would fester, you get infection, there were lots of diseases. When the army was encircling a castle to besiege it and keep the people in the castle from getting food and getting out and hoping that they would surrender, it was sort of a race to see which group would die first from disease. The people in the castle, because they'd be cooped up in the castle and diseases would run rampant and they didn't know how to stop it. And the people in the camp outside would have diseases that would run rampant and kill off hundreds and hundreds of them. So the death in battle wasn't as common as death after battle, because medicine just, they lost some of the stuff that the Romans even knew. That was one of the problems with the Dark Ages. After Rome collapsed, the knowledge that they had developed and knew was seen as a glorious but forgotten art form. So they didn't know how to build the way the Romans did. They didn't know how to sculpt the way the Romans did. They didn't know medicine the way the Romans had figured it out. And it took hundreds of years to figure it out again and resurrect those things. And that's one of the reasons for the existence of the Renaissance. People started realizing, wait a second, those old guys knew some stuff. Let's study it, let's copy them. So you'll see a a huge surge in the arts and sciences during the Renaissance, because people started realizing, you know, there's a lot of knowledge that exists out there someplace, and we can, if we copy the ancients, maybe we can get some of it back. And it was slow, but it did work. Yeah.
Why did they have arrows that big? Why did they have arrows that big?
Ah. Well, why did they have arrows this big? That's just a handy way to store it. This is an experiment that never really worked. Okay, they're shown. Basically, it's a javelin, which is a very small, lightweight spear. But by the time somebody came up with the idea of the giant arrow, it's been seen in French manuscripts from the 1400s, and it's called a flèche de guerre, which just means arrow of war. But it was supposed to be carried by. You were supposed to have 4 or 5 of them in one hand, and you're supposed to get within throwing range of your enemy, and then you're supposed to start just throw them as fast as you could, and then run away.
That sounds like a
Okay?
great.
Now, a couple of things are wrong with that. First of all, you can't throw these very hard. Crossbows and longbows are much more powerful. They shoot a smaller arrow, but a lot harder and a lot farther. So just going like this, you know, it was an idea that somebody had because they knew that, again, in the Renaissance, they knew that the Greeks and the Romans had thrown javelins. So I said, well, let's improve on that. Let's make javelins that'll go straight because they have the feathers like an arrow. We know how to make arrows. Let's just make giant arrows. So that was one of the things that was tried, and probably several thousand were bought and made and used. And then they said, nah, I think I'm going to stick with my crossbowmen and my longbowmen. They're much more effective. And even at that point, the guns, muzzle-loading hand cannons, were more effective than that. So I'm glad you asked about this, because I tend to forget about this thing. Because it's kind of a funny story. It just isn't very effective. Never really worked. An actual javelin is more effective because they're a little heavier, and so when you throw a javelin, it hits a little harder. So, let me see. What else? Yes, Janine. What?
So you said that, like, except for the short, pointy sword, stuff wasn't good against armor. What did work against armor? Did anything work
Okay.
against armor?
Well, the kind of armor I'm wearing, you could attack me with a sword, okay? As I pointed out, I've got several targets that are available. But if you're talking about somebody who's in armored gauntlets, solid steel arms, solid steel neck and helmet and legs, hitting them with a sword really wasn't effective. There's one thing you can do with a sword against armor. Well, there are two things. I'll demonstrate with this. These are called wasters because they're made of wood and they break, and so you throw them out. But two things you can do with a sword against armor. One is, it's called half swording. You hold it on the blade. Just don't go like that, okay? But you can hold it on the blade, and then you can aim it. You can aim it for the eye slit. You can aim it for the armpit. Okay, you can aim it for the palm or behind the knee if that's presented. You need to hold it like this, though, because you're aiming at a target about that big. Okay, so half sorting, and you can use it as a quarterstaff. If the other person attacks you, you can catch it like this and wind it down, put them over here, and then you've got their body open. So half sorting was one technique, and both of these require holding the blade, you'll notice. The other technique was using it like a club. Yeah, and this was
Would never do that.
this was, well, if he did, I would have respected his movies better. Well, it was the directors who did that, not Errol's fault. But this thing up here at the end, okay, originally that was designed, it's called a pommel. Originally it was designed to be sort of a big counterweight to the blade, because otherwise all the weight is out there, but with a little bit of a weight here, it helps lighten, it helps lighten the feel of the blade. Doesn't actually make it lighter, but it balances better. And the blade has a piece of steel going right through the middle of the handle that is then just fastened at the end of this. So that locks the whole blade into the handle. Okay, the piece that goes through the middle is called the tang, and then it's just hammered over. It goes through a hole in the middle of this lump of steel, and it gets hammered over. So you can pummel somebody with the pommel. And it's very much like a club. You can hit them with this, you can hit them with that, you can catch them behind the neck with this or behind the knee and trip them. So using your sword, again, you have to be careful. Either have very tough hands and just make sure you have a good grip so it doesn't slide. You don't want the blade sliding in your fingers. But if you can just hold it and whack somebody, research has been done on how effective that was. There have been a couple of guys, I saw a video a few years ago of one guy in complete steel harness, complete helmet and plate, going against another guy who had no armor, but he had one of these, and he was going to use the pommel just to see how it felt. Everybody knew this was going to happen. So they fought, and he didn't wind up and give a baseball swing. He snapped it from about here down the guy's head, the guy in the armor. The guy in the armor with padding and steel and everything was dazed for a second, didn't knock him out, but it threw him off enough, it rang his bell really hard, that gave the advantage to the guy with no armor. And neither one was expecting it to be that significant, that effective. And so, these are people who do research. It's dangerous, but that was one way that they were able to kind of confirm a theory that some of the old manuals said, well, you can hit them with a pommel, and by golly, it works. But most of the weapons that were used against armor, as part of my kit, as a foot soldier, now where is it? Okay.
Sorry.
I don't know. My pardon me. My bra seems to have fallen.
Wardrobe malfunction.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. They're supposed to crisscross across the back.
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't tell you that. Sorry about that. Okay. I'll stay like this, and that way it won't fall. Okay. The axe was around for again millennia, and it was this is not a wood chopping axe. Okay, this is a battle axe. The difference is a battle axe has a very thin head, a thin blade. It's only meant to deliver force to the front edge of the curve. All the weight and all the force, it's not spread out much. It's just delivered by the edge. That's effective against armor because you can actually dent and bend armor with it. War hammers, you can guess what they look like. And maces, you've probably seen them, but basically it's a club with metal flanges sticking out. Those were designed to fight against armor, and they were the most effective weapons. Armor basically is put together using hammers, so you can also take it apart using a hammer, or a battle axe, or a mace. If you think of the finely articulated joints that I described in that one suit of armor that had the arms with the sliding joints and sliding rivets that all fit together so nicely, that worked great as long as it isn't dented. You put a big dent in that and all of a sudden the guy's arm is locked like this. Okay, he can't move his arm. That was one of the drawbacks of armor, is if it got dented in the joints, shoulder, elbow, knee, wherever, in the chest even, you're limiting your opponent's mobility. And you can also maybe pop some rivets and pieces of the armor will start falling off. Not a good situation to be in. So yeah, hammers, axes, and maces were the most effective weapons against armor. But the sword had such cachet that everybody still wanted to carry one, even into battle. So you'd have your sword here, and you'd have your real weapon tucked into your belt someplace. And that was again part of how you presented yourself. If you looked ragtag, it didn't reflect well on your lord. If you looked really cool and outfitted with swords and real macho cool stuff like that, that reflected well on your lord and added to his glory, which was, again, crucial in the Middle Ages. Yeah.
Not one maybe. What kind of stuff do you do at your reenactments?
Okay, good question. What we do, well, there are two things we do. One was, there was a museum in Worcester, Massachusetts called the Higgins Armory Museum. And we used to go there before they closed down. We used to go there and do talks about the medieval armies, Army of Burgundy. They had a group of child-sized halberds, like this thing, except like this thing, only made out of wood. And we would get volunteers from the audience and form a halberd line and teach them basic halberd drills. And that was a lot of fun. I'm not equipped to do that here, I'm sorry. Then when the Higgins closed, almost all of their collection went to the Worcester Art Museum. And so we continued going there, but being an art museum rather than an armory museum, it became a little less dynamic. And since COVID, we haven't, of course, done anything. The other thing we did was, I called it sort of missionary work. The other thing we did was go to a couple of Ren fairs. And Ren fairs are a lot of fun. They're not really history. They're kind of history. There are people there who are interested in history. So we were there trying to show them some real history or living history, and in hopes of just stimulating a greater interest in our particular area. And that was a lot of fun, because you do run into people who say, hey, I didn't know you guys existed. That's really, you run into people who are enthusiastic about it. You run into some people who are doing their own thing. There's a group in Connecticut, I believe. Well, they're probably from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, called Das Gelb-Fähnlein, which is German for the yellow banner. And they represent our grandchildren, basically. They represent the early 1500s, Landsknechts, and they're the ones with the, Michelle was telling me earlier about something I was doing about fashion, and they're the ones that got the whole slashed doublet thing going, because they were warriors, and after a battle, their clothes would be all slashed up from axes and pikes and stuff like that. And rather than mend them, they wore contrasting color undergarments so that each of the cuts would stand out and be obvious. And that then became formalized and became actual fashion, and people wanted to dress like that because the Landsknechts were cool. I guess was the reason. But yeah, so those are the things we do. We don't reenact battles. Well, that's not true. Some of us do. I actually, before I joined Wolf Argent, I was up at the Higgins. I studied medieval manuals on swordplay and dagger fighting and using a halberd. So we were basically, one of the curators had gotten his hands on a manuscript from the late 1500s that gave some hints as to how to fight with these different things. And it was up to our group, our study group, to try to interpret that stuff and figure out what the manuals actually mean. When they say, you come over his arm with your other arm and then trip him lustily upon his back. And you say, okay, which arm of whose what? How are we doing this? And there were illustrations, so we try different things and try different permutations until we got what we thought was the most effective way to do that. That was a lot of fun. I'm one of the few people you'll meet probably who knows how to fight with a halberd. Probably more of them with swords and daggers, but I can actually use this thing. Yes, Michelle.
So, were the soldiers provided a basic level of armor from the lord that they were fighting for, or was everybody kind of left on their own? I mean, it sounds like if you had means, you were able to get yourself better armor, but were people at least given something to start with, and then, so like,
Okay, the question was the soldier a basic common soldier, like foot soldier like me? Was he provided with weapons and armor by somebody, or did he have to provide his own? And yes, is the answer to your question. All of those scenarios played out. It depended on your time and place. The personal guard of a lord depended on how wealthy the lord was, how well they were equipped. They would be provided more standardized equipment by their lord, so that because they were a direct reflection of his puissance, his power, his might, his wealth. So the personal guard was like the creme de la creme. So they would have matching clothes, because he would provide their clothes. They would have, as much as possible, matching armors, things like that, and weapons. Most soldiers had to make do with, sometimes, I said that there were some cities that made an industry of producing armor and weapons. I think Nuremberg was one, Milan was one, Innsbruck and Augsburg, and there were a few around Europe. And they exported thousands of pieces of armor and thousands of weapons all around Europe. There was quite a good trade in that. So a lord, let's say you're a minor baron, and you want to equip some foot soldiers. You would have leftovers in your armory, left over from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that had been mended and fixed and made operable. A lot of it's outdated, okay, but it's armor. You'll make do. So you might provide some of that, and you might say, if you can get your hands on better armor, go ahead. I want mine back, okay? But you know, if you can find something better, it's up to the individual to upgrade. They were required not to sell their armor. They couldn't get rid of their armor or make money by selling it to somebody else, because that would have encouraged everybody to sell their old stuff, and then the lord has nothing. You know, the lord's soldiers are unarmed, so that doesn't work. There were also, you know, plunder of war. If you were on a battlefield and somebody looked like your size and you could get their breastplate, that was okay. Plunder was one of the basic exchange plans, basic exchange rates. One of the ways that soldiers were paid. Lots of commanders tried to control plundering because they wanted their guys to keep fighting until the battle was over, rather than stop at a particularly wealthy corpse and start pulling stuff off of it. Well, and that happened. You know, you want to get it before the guy behind you gets it. He's got a ring on his finger. Come on. So they tried to control that by saying, okay, all the plunder will be collected after the battle's over, and we'll divide it equally. And sometimes they had to enforce that with pretty draconian measures, because it went very much against the grain of somebody who's risking his life and hoping for plunder, and then he sees a chance to get something really good. So it was a capital offense in a lot of armies if you were caught plundering. But it was also a way that you attracted recruits, saying that there would be plunder that would be shared out. So that was another one of those recurring cyclical things that just went on and on. But yeah, the army that I represent, the Duke of Burgundy's 1475 is my year. The Duke of Burgundy's army is one of the first attempts in Europe since Roman times to have a standardized standing army, rather than the feudal levy, which was common in Europe from the time of Charlemagne. The feudal levy consisted of this pyramid scheme where there's a king at the top, and he owns everything really, but he lets the dukes administer and profit from parts of his domain. So they owe responsibility to him, but they can draw an income from the lands that he gives them. And then the dukes, of course, can't manage it all on their own, so they make some viscounts and earls and stuff like that, and barons, to be their subordinates, and they parcel out some of their holdings to those minor lords, who then administer and enforce the rules, and they become the judges and the juries and the executioners and the policemen for that. And they also owe military service to the next lord up. So that's the feudal system. It's a trickle-down economics. What the Duke of Burgundy tried to do was, rather than have those call-up militias, basically, if the king decided to go to war, he'd tell the dukes, okay, get your guys together, and the dukes would tell the barons, and the barons would tell the knights, and the knights would tell their peasants, okay, everybody, we're going to war. You 10 peasant men, you look healthy, come with me, here's a helmet, here's a spear. Okay? That was the feudal system. Not a lot of training at the infantry level, which worked to the knights' advantage because the knights remained the ruling power on the battlefield. They didn't have to worry about the infantry, just gallop over them and they fall apart for the most part. But with the rise of the middle class, there was more money going around. So the peasants actually moved up, and they were like upper level peasants, or they were lower level middle class, and they could afford some training, and they could buy their own weapons and armor. And towns formed militias, so that the militias then would train. The militias weren't knights wearing full suits of armor. The militias were just regular shopkeepers or apprentices who practiced on Sunday afternoons, okay, after Mass, because everybody was Catholic. They would practice longbow or halberd drill or sword fighting, so they were actually trained better than most other armies because they trained once a week. And it was a very convivial, social kind of thing. All the guys would get together and you'd retire to the pubs afterwards. But that was actually legislated. The kings of England legislated that everybody in England, every village would have an archery range, and every male would practice archery after Mass on Sundays. That would be your activity. Okay, so you can imagine people turned that into sort of a festival. They'd have competitions, and Lot would go up against John, and they'd see who the better archer was, and they'd set the targets farther and farther back, and it became part of the culture. And that's why the English kings, who didn't draw from a particularly large population or a particularly wealthy country, were able to field armies that were at least 50% archers. And that made a huge change in the battlefields of Europe. During the 100 Years' War, archery became, the longbow especially, which originated in Wales, and the English knew a good thing when they saw it, and they adopted it. The longbow became sort of the ruling weapon of the battlefield, because it was very effective against those wealthy millionaire knights on their fancy horses. And here you are in a mail shirt and a little skull cap, but you've got a bow that shoots at 110 pounds, which is incredibly heavy for nowadays. And it can go through armor. So that was another thing that changed the whole use of armor.